It is an honor to be here tonight. I want to do a few thank yous, introduce the MTSU Debate Team, and then I will let today's moderator take over from that and explain who's debating and what's going on. And then we will have a friendly debate with our guests from Ireland. All right, so first of all, I would like to thank our sponsors beyond just the normal financial thank yous, but the actual thank yous, because they've supported this. This is not the 10th year in a row because of that weird COVID thing, but this is 10 years since we hosted the first group of Irish debaters at MTSU, and so it's something that the school has supported for a very long time. It is a great event for everyone involved. And so I want to thank MTSU in general, but specifically Dean Weil and the Honors College in which you're sitting, and Dean Lyons, my dean in the College of Liberal Arts. I would like to thank the Provost's office. We're fortunate to have a member of the Provost's office here who was also a former debater and forensics speaker and a former coach of the event, so it's nice to have those friends. I would like to thank my department chair, Dr. Mary Asbeth, for being here, and the Department of Communication Studies, who deals with the day-to-day nonsense of running speech and debate team. And MTSU is an old debate team. We are the oldest continual student group at MTSU, founded with the university and the Claxton Literary Societies. And as time progressed, literary societies kind of branched off to English clubs and debate clubs. And well, unfortunately, those clubs are no longer there, but we are. And so we can say we have that lineage and that heritage. And MTSU has grown into becoming not a state competitive, regional competitive, but a nationally competitive team. And that is because the students on our team are a mix of campus. We are a walk-on team. Our current president is a communication studies major. Our current Pi Kappa Delta honorary society president, who is in charge of the logistics of this event, is a physics major. The debate leader, who couldn't be here because he's working, is a engineering mechatronics major. And so we have majors from all over the university. And it doesn't matter if you're a freshman, sophomore. I ask for two things to join this team. One is a financial issue. If you say you're going to go to a tournament, you actually have to go because the school pays money. And you know how the school is with money, so you got to go. But the really important one by far is you have to try. And as long as you try, you can come back. You'll get better over time, and the wins will come naturally. We don't make that a premium of this team because we want your skills to get better. So if it's something you're interested in, out in the audience, we have some business cards over there with QR codes on the back, and that's how you join the team. And there is not a major on this campus that you wouldn't learn skills to help you with in that major. So thank you all for coming in today. Hopefully we will have a very delightful debate. I will not go on and on. It's a very timely topic. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to our moderator, who is a senior in the College of Media Entertainment and is also the editor of the student newspaper and will be attending University of Tennessee Knoxville Law School in the fall. August Williams, where are you? Oh, and August is also an honor student.
Alright, hello everyone. My name is August and I will be your moderator for today's debate. So first I'm going to introduce our guests from Ireland. First we have Liam Boyce, then we have Rob Fitzpatrick, and finally we have Adrian Ward, and that will be the order in which they will be speaking. And then we have our debaters here at MTSU. First speaking will be Sage Robinson, who is a psychology and pre-law major, Gus Sanders, who is a political science and sociology major, and Nick Massey, who is an interactive media major. So the resolution, or the topic that we are going to be debating today, is this House believes NATO is obsolete. So each speaker that you see here today will give a 7-minute speech. After the first minute, you will hear a big slam on the table from me, and this will indicate that the opposition can ask questions, and then when we hit the last minute again, you'll hear that big slam again, which means they'll no longer be able to ask questions. And so one of the most important things to keep in mind for today's debate round is that this is an academic debate. Our team members do not get to pick which side they are on. They might personally agree with this statement, they might personally disagree with this statement. What they say may not reflect their personal views. Thank you.
I'm about to start my 7-minute speech right about now. First off, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. It's an honor to get to have this fun little show debate in front of you guys today. I want to say thank you to our guests. It's nice to have you here in America. And thank you to my fellow teammates for being here with me today. With that, my name is Sage Robinson, representing MTSU, and I'm going to lay out the main assets of our case in this first speech. So like the moderator stated, we are looking at this House believes NATO is obsolete. And in case anyone did not know what NATO was, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Obsolete is simply going to be defined as no longer useful. So what we're looking at in this fun little show debate is that NATO is or isn't useful anymore in today's time. That's going to lead me into the first thing I'd like to discuss, which is going to be no more purpose. No more purpose. Because throughout this first point, I'm going to go through what is NATO's purpose? What was it founded for? What's it about? And is it fulfilling that purpose? Because if we're going to argue today if something's useful or not, you need to know what it was created to do and if it is doing that anymore in today's time. So, no more purpose. As many of us probably know, it was originally created in 1949 during the rise of the Cold War. Its intended purpose was to deter the Soviet Union as a growing threat, and it was primarily formed as a military alliance. That's going to be important as I move into further points. And a core part of NATO's creation was that special Article 5, which states that their core principle was that an attack on one is an attack on all. And you're going to see that come into play later in my speech. So, obviously, the Soviet Union is not a threat right now in current time. So how have they changed their mission purpose? What does NATO now focus on? What is their intended goal? According to NATO's website, their intended goal is to guarantee freedom and security of members through political and military means. And their current focus... Yes, I'll take your question.
If it wasn't useful, then why did Putin invade Ukraine in 2014 and more recently, just as Ukraine was about to join NATO?
Can you ask me the question one more time, please?
If it wasn't useful, then why did Putin invade Ukraine in 2014 and more recently, just as Ukraine was about to join NATO and get those guarantees?
You will see that in my second point. I promise I will touch on that question. Their current focus right now, stated in their 2022 strategic concept, states that Russia is the most significant threat to the Allies. So in 2022, NATO recognized Russia as a large threat. Following that, in 2025, more recently, NATO has stated their solidarity with Ukraine. This is going to touch on kind of the question I was just asked. So, with NATO acknowledging Ukraine and acknowledging that, hey, we support them, we support their efforts, they have every right to this Self-Defense Act. But we have seen no physical intervention from NATO in this regard. They have supplied aid, they have supplied training resources, but there has been no troops actually physically touching down on behalf of NATO to aid Ukraine. And this is going to have a very large impact when we look at if NATO is obsolete, it is useful in the Russian and Ukraine conflict. Because if their intended goal is to defend and protect this crisis happening, then how come the 32 member countries have displayed no military action to protect Ukraine or deter Russia? I'll take your question.
Surely this is just because Ukraine is not currently a NATO member. There's no actual legal obligation for them to send any troops.
Yes, and to that I'd like to say, then why are we aiding and funding Ukraine? If Ukraine isn't even considered an official member, why are we giving them resources? That's what we're looking at here. And additionally with this, NATO has even stated that that Ukraine is en route to having official membership. They're en route to being declared an official member of NATO, but they're not necessarily there. So we're on that borderline with, okay, we're providing them aid, we're providing their resources, but they're not actually a member of our organization, so we're not having any physical intervention. Then what's the point? What is the purpose there? That's what we're looking at here. With that, that's going to lead me to the second point I'd like to introduce, which is going to be long-term inaction. Long-term inaction. Not only do we see how they've not physically gotten involved in the Russia and Ukraine conflict, they have a trend in history more so over the last 10 years of not getting physically involved in any matters. The most recent military intervention by NATO as an organization was in 2011. That's over 10 years ago. And additionally with this, the last time that the NATO organization got involved the time before that, the last time before 2011 that the organization got involved with a problem as a whole was right after the 9/11 attacks. So over the past 10 years, we've seen one physical intervention by NATO, and before that, the last intervention wasn't since 2001. So, what have they been focused on? The NATO website states that they are focusing their involvement on cyber security, training exercises, defense investments. So they're building up their organization over the 10 years. Well, if they're doing that, why haven't they physically intervened in the Russia and Ukraine conflict? They have the means to do so. They have been physically inactive for the past 10 years, and now they have the opportunity to make real physical impact, but they aren't. That's showing how they are obsolete and no longer useful. That's going to lead me to the third point I would like to introduce, which is going to be instability and inconsistency. The U.S. went to war with Iraq, right? And let's go back to that Article 5 principle. An attack on one is an attack on all. During this war, NATO did not join the war effort alongside the U.S. That's really important because if NATO's one of their core principles that they were built on and still have in action is that an attack on one is an attack on all, why weren't we seeing that joint effort? I will take your question.
There was over 400 British casualties in Iraq, coming from the fact that Britain is also a NATO member and they went and supported the US there. That is just a complete inaccuracy.
What we're looking at with that here for more clarification is that when the U.S. went to war with Iraq, NATO as a whole, the whole 32 countries that are involved in the NATO organization did not join the U.S. in a fight alongside the organization. We weren't seeing this attack on one really be an attack on all because the U.S., although may be getting aid, there may have been disagreements among members on how to be involved with that war. That is the principle of the organization. If you're going to pick and choose how to apply that principle, that makes it obsolete. Next, I would also like to add to this point that the U.S. this comes from Rochester, the U.S. tends to spend more on NATO defense than any other country. So, hypothetically, the U.S. pulling out of NATO would take a big hit to the organization. And with Trump's first term, he stated on and off again that he would threaten to leave the organization. And we will see if that may happen in this term. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank MTSU for hosting us here today. It's been absolutely fantastic so far. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in times of unprecedented global shifts. Now, more than ever, Western defensive cooperation is crucial for guaranteeing the security of all of us. The proposition will try to convince you this evening that NATO has run its course. It's the end of the line. They will go on about shifting allegiances or the Trump effect, but let's be clear, NATO is going nowhere. As the United States is about to find out, we live in an increasingly interdependent world. When the consequences of Trump's tariffs come back to bite him, he will realise, or at least his citizens will, that he needs Europe and Europe needs him. The same principle applies to defence. Military cooperation through the means of NATO is absolutely essential for our security. Tonight, Team Ireland will outline the reasons for this across three key areas. Firstly, I will discuss examples of recent successful NATO interventions, particularly in the post-Soviet era, and how they demonstrate that its raison d'etre is still alive and well. I will then go on to discuss modern operations of cybersecurity and counter-terrorism and how they are utterly vital to our modern day security. Then Rob will discuss the financial viability of NATO and explain how, with the US, NATO is strong, but without it, it can be just as effective. Finally, our team captain, Shining Light, Adrienne, will summarise our arguments and provide rebuttals. So, in terms of the actions of NATO in the post-Soviet era, it has been extremely efficient and effective in its operations. In the 1990s, for example, you had the NATO intervention in the former Yugoslavia. One crucial element of that was the intervention in Kosovo in 1998. This intervention literally prevented a genocide of ethnic Albanians by the Serbs in Kosovo. The bombings by NATO were brutal but absolutely necessary. It included the United States, but also included a coalition of multiple NATO member states. If you go to Kosovo or Albania today, you will see statues of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair because of that crucial intervention. The names of children in Albania, Tony Blair is one of the most popular names, an Albanian version of it, specifically because of this NATO intervention. More recently, you've had the crucial intervention in Libya following the 2011 unrest during the Arab Spring. The opposition has said that the number of interventions have been limited, but this demonstrates the exact effectiveness of the NATO organisation. The fact that there haven't been more demonstrates a deterrent effect. Countries wouldn't dare intervene or invade a NATO member state. In fact, no NATO member state has ever been invaded. This in itself demonstrates the effectiveness of NATO globally. In terms of Russia and Ukraine, the reason for Russia's intervention initially in 2014 and then the all-out assault in 2022 is because of timing. Ukraine was on track to join NATO. Russia saw this as a threat. That in itself demonstrates the effectiveness of NATO because Russia knew about its effectiveness. Sweden and Finland, immediately following the invasion in 2022, made applications to join NATO. Not because they thought it was obsolete, but because they thought it was effective, and it is. NATO guarantees their security and guarantees the security of Europe. Now on to cybersecurity and counterterrorism. NATO cooperation in this area is absolutely crucial. Modern warfare requires that NATO and NATO member states be completely up to date with this area. Hacking and cyber attacks are becoming the new normal in terms of warfare. While the proposition might dismiss this, it is absolutely crucial to security. Whole societies can collapse. For example, whole societies can collapse in the event that cybersecurity is not looked after, and NATO is crucial to this. Yes, what?
To go back to an earlier point, why exactly did NATO intervene with, what was it, Libya?
The NATO intervention in Libya, I'm not aware of the specifics of it, but I do know that it was in relation to the fall of Gaddafi. But what my point overall is that NATO interventions, while they have been limited, they have been absolutely effective in the global security and in NATO's effectiveness, not just in terms of Libya, but in terms of other incidences, specifically like the former Yugoslavia. In terms of counterterrorism, the actions of NATO in Iraq and of Afghanistan have quelled the influence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. You mightn't see the benefits of it because nobody's going around saying, thank God a terrorist attack didn't occur. They are not saying that because it is unbelievably crucial that those terrorist attacks didn't occur because of NATO. Yes, go ahead.
Are you aware of the fall of the Afghan instated government after the invasion in Afghanistan?
Yes. Yes, I am absolutely aware of that. And I'm not disputing that fact at all, but what I am saying is that Al-Qaeda and ISIS, once extremely powerful global terrorist organizations, their influence has been completely quelled by NATO. So to conclude, it is clear that NATO is not obsolete. Not only so, it is unbelievably important to the security of the Western world and our way of life. Through my statements, I've proved this, and Robin, Adrian will conclude our arguments later in this debate. Thank you.
I will begin now. Hello everyone, I just wanted to thank you all for coming out here again today to see this show debate, and especially thank you to the Irish team for coming to visit us here at Middle Tennessee State University. Now with that, I'd like to get into a little bit of a roadmap for how I'm going to address this speech today and potentially address my opponent's points. First, I'm going to get into a few points brought up by the negation, then a few by the first affirmation speech, and then my own contingents today. Now, my opponent brings up many great points, and that is that the shifts in security and guarantees in the world are very important. That times are changing and that the world is more connected now than it ever has been. I'm not arguing against this idea. As a matter of fact, I think it's very true. But however, NATO is not actually the solution to this. Again, my opponent brings up many recent successes of NATO intervention in the world, and with that they especially bring up the Yugoslav wars and the potential genocides that occurred in Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Serbia, Albania, and Kosovo. And to that I say, yes, NATO has been effective in these areas, but we're looking at what it's doing now. We're looking about, is it an outdated institution now? And there's many cases in which it has not been successful. My opponent also brought up the fact that Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda were attacked by NATO, and there were many operations taken to it. The first affirmation brought up in their speech how NATO can be perceived as no longer being useful, and that it is not necessarily good at intervention when it does intervention, and that its long-term plans are not always successfully achieved. And with that, I could not agree more, and I would like to get into a few great arguments for why this is. And that would be the pointless transactions and the lack of change that NATO truly brings. Now, what I really mean by the pointless transactions and the lack of change that NATO brings, there's a great example of this in Afghanistan. This all comes from NATO's own website and official operations carried out by NATO themselves. In 2015 through 2021, the Resolute support mission in yes.
Do you think 20 years of freedom for women so they weren't under Taliban rule was a worthwhile endeavour, even if it has since collapsed?
Yes, but the collapse is going to inevitably lead to a lot of damage to said women. In 2015 through 2021, the Resolute support mission in Afghanistan sought to create a secure society, to create a safe government for people within Afghanistan. This meant rights for women, this meant rights for minority groups. And with that, there is a noticeable emphasis on training the military of this state that was created. And to that I ask, where is this state today? What is the state of Afghanistan now? It is now run by terrorist extremist groups. It is run by extreme religious zealots who force women to wear veils in public, who completely destroy freedoms of speech and freedoms created by NATO. Yes?
The purpose of the intervention in Afghanistan was to destroy Al-Qaeda, not to bring down the Taliban government. That was a byproduct of the intervention.
And even with that said, by the negation, there is still a point to be made about NATO's intervention within Afghanistan itself. Just because there should be the security of Western powers to have their citizens be safe, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and various other terrorist attacks throughout Western Europe do not necessarily create a good solution in Afghanistan itself. Again, with NATO trying to seek and promote democracy and peace, not just for themselves necessarily, but worldwide, have they truly done that within Afghanistan? Are the people in Afghanistan free today? Are the millions of lives lost in the Middle East actually worth the pain that we put everyone through? And even with these Middle Eastern invasions, even with these conflicts, there's a lack of unity in it all. And that is the fact that NATO is united, but not really. And with NATO's unification, with its military intervention, with its sort of singular military goal, there is this underlying notion of peace. However, that peace can be broken by two NATO nations themselves. Greece and Turkey are known to be in conflict all the time. Maybe not military conflict in the modern day, but in 1974, there were many conflicts over the island of Cyprus. Cyprus had tried to join the Greek state, and Turkey invaded it in order to prevent this from happening. Both of these nations were members of NATO. And if NATO is a defensive military alliance, how can two states be combating each other and allied with each other? It simply makes no sense. It breaks down the unity of a treaty like this itself, and thus makes NATO obsolete if its own members can't even follow their own rules. With that, there is a bit more evidence these days that nations in NATO have been increasing their military spending and have been increasing their budgets. However, within the past, many nations failed to meet the 2% GDP military spending guideline by NATO itself. One of these nations, notably, is France, another one being Germany, two of the largest economic powers within Europe and the NATO alliance. If these nations that are supposedly so economically powerful can manage to have influences around the world, why can they not manage to contribute their part to an alliance? Why can they not spend the bare minimum guidelines set out by NATO? Why can they not unify with the rest of them? And with that, I'd like to get into the new age that has come about with this Ukrainian war. With Ukraine, there is a lot of military spending by NATO. It is estimated that, according to Al Jazeera, in 2023 alone, Ukraine received 75.5 billion euros despite not being an actual NATO member or ally yet. Again, NATO has no actual obligations to Ukraine. NATO is not allied to Ukraine. Just because something terrible is happening does not mean there's any legal obligations. And by dragging the economies of all of these countries down and not actually intervening, they aren't actually doing much. Ukraine's population is very low, and many people continue to leave. Just because we send them more military equipment doesn't mean they'll actually be able to effectively use this equipment and help their people. In order to do that, they're going to need troops. They're going to need boots on the ground. But that can't be risked because of NATO's uneasiness.
Ladies and gentlemen, the fatalistic view on NATO that side proposition propagates is based upon falsehoods and inaccuracy about the operations and the interdependence of NATO that NATO guarantees. This evening, Team Ireland will show you why, even without the US, NATO is not only viable but irreplaceable, and we will also show that NATO is of huge benefit to the United States as it is today. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we heard from side proposition. So first of all, they talk about the idea of Ukraine and ask why it is that NATO has not intervened in Ukraine. And there is a very simple answer to this. Ukraine is not within NATO, and so there is no obligation for NATO countries to send troops on the ground. But regardless of this, a lot of NATO members are in fact allies of Ukraine and have been allied with them for many years. For example, in invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan to support the United States, Ukraine did send, in fact, many thousands of soldiers in order to support those missions. And so it is not necessarily NATO that is responding to the call for aid, but it is individual countries that have an obligation to the Ukraine. But even if that is not so, allies of Ukraine still want to support them because of the buffer that it prevents Russia from being able to gain territory closer to European nations, such as France, such as Germany, and we think that we're better able to support that with NATO. Secondarily, I'm unsure as to what their alternative actually is, because they say that NATO is obsolete. However, the comparative difference between having NATO and not having NATO is clearly something that is much worse. We are unsure what the type of pain we'd put individuals and citizens in the Middle East through if there was no such thing as a NATO intervention, because there have been successes there. We look at places such as Syria, which has overturned their government and are now putting in place institutions in order to ensure elements of democracy. We think that what this means is we are able to show that we are able to provide some form of benefit. They then talk about Greece and Turkey as though Greece and Turkey is going to be is an example whereby NATO is not able to support itself. But I think that this is also looking at an example further in the past, whereby since then, the relationships between those countries have progressed hugely because of the use of NATO as a means to talk to each other about defence and the means to be able to actually have these types of conversations. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
Is creating a buffer state a historically effective solution to curbing a encroaching power?
It doesn't matter whether or not it's an effective way of doing it. I'm giving you the reasons as to why European countries are in fact providing aid to Ukraine beyond the fact that they're not a member of NATO. Secondly then, I think what a lot of is made of is the US and how Europe doesn't pull its weight when it comes to NATO in regards to the finances. But I think that while Europe may not, and European nations may not always contribute to the 2% of their GDP, this was an arbitrary number that was simply made up as a marker by which you are able to contribute to NATO in a meaningful way. It doesn't mean that these European nations have ineffectual armies. And moreover, the US actually agreed to become the global policeman, to become the one who has the most military power after the Second World War, when they wanted to be the most powerful state in the world and they wanted Europe to be dependent upon them. So it is quite rich to have the US come back then and say that the Europeans are the ones who are not pulling their weight when the US took on this burden themselves. When you look at any conflict in the last 30 years that the US has been involved in, key strategic points in battles have depended upon many European powers. For example, in Kosovo, the types of examples that Liam talked about, 4,000 British Army, Australians, Italians, French, Danish people all went and fought in those wars in order to protect the interests of NATO and show that NATO is not obsolete and there is more contributions from Europe than America thinks. Similarly, in Afghanistan, as I raised in a point of information, over 400 British casualties came out of those types of conflicts. I think that this shows that there is a give and take in this regard. And I wouldn't say this lightly, but they have literally pushed Irish people to defend the British Army, which is not something that happens very often. The bottom line is that just because France and Britain don't reach 2% doesn't mean that they're bad at contributing to NATO. The US just spends an inordinate amount of money upon their military. For example, we have the idea of the US military bringing forward a Boeing plane and spending 50 grand on a soap dispenser within that Boeing plane in order to increase the spending of their military budget. You have budgets that are overinflated, whereby Congress give money to the US military and then they spend it on planes that are never flown and are never actually useful for the military to begin with because they never asked for them. These are the types of things that the US military spends money on. We say that the European model is probably a little bit better. Why then is Europe okay without the US? I think that there are three reasons for this. The first is that there are historical institutions and military institutions within the US, or within Europe, that provide a sense of security. For example, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, has a large history of excellence in the air. Same with the British Navy, that have years of experience in provision of this kind of thing. Sorry, guys, for saying that. I know, it hurts me too. The second thing is that, if needs be, there is an increase in the defensive budget. So we've already shown that you can have a coordinated and good response to the crisis in Ukraine. After Trump said that he was going to remove all funding, there was meetings between Britain, France and Germany regarding the type of funding that they're going to put into place, and they agreed massive aid packages between them. So there is space for that coordination to happen. But the third is that if the US does pull out of NATO, and if there is that type of issue, there is pressure to the EU to create a standing army, which has been talked about for years. Given that the EU has a huge amount of coordination already in things such as their like unified currency and things such as trade, this is not something that's hard to believe could also be effective. So what we have shown across our two speeches and what our shining light will provide at the end of the debate is a clear conception of how not only NATO is not obsolete, it is not dependent upon the US. It is also increasingly coming forward into the 21st century with its integration into things such as cybersecurity that Liam talked about. And for all of those reasons, I beg you to oppose.
Alrighty. Today we've had a good conversation, a good back and forth on why NATO is both obsolete but somehow not. Yet I stand here in firm affirmation that NATO is still obsolete. You see, NATO had served its purpose, as pointed out by my colleague Sage in their first rebuttal, or their first speech, excuse me, and how Article 5 is attack on one is attack on all. If the US is ponying up and being the primary defender, then it's not really an attack on all, it's an attack on us. No pun intended. That being stated, it still seems that we're in a disagreement. That all these different aspects of Putin invading Ukraine, of NATO not needing to go anywhere, of the military operations that were necessary, how the US benefits from cybersecurity and counterterrorism, their efficient and effective use in Kosovo and Albania, their different uses in Libya, how they required strength on the cyber fronts, how Iraq and Afghanistan had involvement from NATO, how ISIS and Al-Qaeda were quelled, we'll get back to that in a moment, how NATO is of huge benefit to the US, how the buffer zone that is created from us referencing and keeping Ukraine as is, how we, post-World War II, burdened ourselves with this responsibility, how we were protecting NATO interests, how we're overspending in the US military, and only now are other nations starting to pony up a massive aid package that we never had seen before. My colleagues have pointed out to you in many different ways that NATO had its use, and I agree, it had its use. It currently no longer serves its purpose, the purpose of trying to quell that which was overwhelming at the time, this being the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, NATO definitely had its purpose for that. But if we look at this long-term inaction that we've seen, this fact that it's been over 10 years since the last action NATO has put forth, how Ukraine is not a part of NATO, yet we're still assisting it, and how we all seem to have this benefit from it, even though it is not currently present. How these things play out still has yet to be seen. I'll take your question.
So do you completely reject the argument that NATO acts as a deterrent?
You can both be a deterrent without having to be an overwhelming force. You can deter and still presently have presence. It kind of seems like a double negative, but that's the nature of the thing. It's no matter how large and powerful you seem to be, you still are only as vulnerable as your weakest link. And in NATO, that seems to be the European powers, or at least that's what we presented. Now, we've also pointed out earlier on that we've had this threatened to leave NATO several times before. Though certainly, as would be pointed out by my opposition, not the ideal scenario, it's still a scenario, and it's one that we may have to pursue. If NATO is going nowhere, then the US pulling out should clearly not have any effect. It would have only one member be dissipated from the several nations that are involved. Surely if, as my opposition pointed out, they're coming up with other ways of providing aid to Ukraine, then if the US does pull out, then these other nations will simply have to step up and do it themselves. Now, if they're doing it themselves, then the question becomes, why isn't the US even needed to be involved in the first place? My second colleague pointed out that the entirety of the war in Afghanistan was a pointless transaction. It seemed that, though my opponents would have you believe ISIS and Al-Qaeda were quelled, we both agreed at one point that the long-term effects were that nothing actually happened. It all deteriorated back to the way it was. We also pointed out that there's a lack of unity in NATO. I think the fact that we even had to throw around a threat, and that's just it, it's a threat, of having to leave, is a bit crazy. If we were unified, we wouldn't be having to threaten anything. We'd be saying, we want to keep supporting you, we want to keep working together. But for some reason, we're having to threaten our very stake in NATO just so people will change their mind. Now, nations in NATO have not necessarily contributed the 2%. And that 2% may be an arbitrary number. But if it is an arbitrary number, then what's the U.S. have anything to do with that? If the U.S. leaves, then then the arbitrarity becomes even more evident. They have no more contribution, therefore there is no change. They just left. It was their choice. We also stated that in 2023, we have sent 75.5 billion euros to Ukraine. But what have we seen of it? What kind of benefit have we seen? What kind of harm have we seen? We actually haven't seen much. It's been very quiet, and oddly so. In conclusion, the U.S. has a purpose in NATO. It did have a purpose. That purpose has long since passed. And I believe that NATO is obsolete, and that we can overcome it by pushing further and further into sustaining ourselves. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, America may think they can go it alone. Narratives like being the global policeman have told you that NATO is a one-way transaction. These types of views were reflected in recent comments by J.D. Vance, where he referred to the British Army as some random army which hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. Look, again, as Rob said, it takes a lot for Irish people to in any way, shape or form defend the British Army. But in the last 40 years, the British Army has fought alongside Americans in the Gulf War, in the Bosnian War, in the Kosovo War, in the Afghanistan War, in the Iraq War, in Sierra Leone, in Libya, and in Yemen. The presence of the Brits in those wars not only helped in material, practical terms, it added legitimacy without which these wars would have been hard to sustain. So yes, America has undeniably made contributions to global security, but they stood on the shoulders of allies whose contributions we ought to acknowledge. Now, even if proposition think that NATO is obsolete, even a proposition may think that NATO is obsolete, and you know who doesn't think that NATO is obsolete? Our biggest adversaries. The mere possibility of Ukraine joining NATO was enough to make Putin declare a war. Now, if NATO is in fact obsolete, why did Putin see it as such a threat? They point to the lack of interventions by NATO as evidence that NATO is obsolete. We tell you that in fact the lack of interventions is evidence of the success of NATO. We should not be proud of the wars that NATO has fought, but of the wars that have been avoided because of NATO and the countless lives that would have been lost had it not been for the threat of Article 5. We've experienced unprecedented decades of peace in Europe and the Western world, and that is in big part due to the presence of NATO.
In what ways does the United Kingdom becoming involved more with American wars actually lend legitimacy to these wars? Would that not just make it seem more imperial, especially in places like Sierra Leone, which are a former British colony?
No, I don't think it makes it seem more imperial at all. I think there's a reason why Bush didn't want to go it alone in Iraq, and why he wanted, what was it, that like something of friends, so they had some weird term for it, but it does lend legitimacy when other countries are involved, because it doesn't just seem like a once-off operation that is like not approved by Congress or really anybody in the United States. It's gotten more support around the world, which does lend an amount of legitimacy to the war, and beyond that it just is boots on the ground. People died in all of those, British soldiers died in all of those operations. They practically helped with the war effort. Those sort of contributions should be acknowledged. And throughout your bench, you've rightly pointed out that the US has contributed a lot to NATO, but you've sort of underestimated the contributions that other countries have made. We're just trying to point out that it's not just that the US can decide on a whim to pull out of NATO. It is an interdependent relationship. So you can do that, but you would likely do that at your own peril. Like, these are your allies that you're meant to support. These are people who have supported you in the past. So I think you underestimate the contributions that other countries have made, and how they would, like as Rob told you, even if the US was to leave NATO, that Europe would probably be okay. We would probably be able to sustain NATO on our own. And so I don't think just the mere fact that America contributes more in terms of GDP and to their military defense means that they're the only ones who are contributing anything to NATO. I also think what proposition have seemed to overlook in this debate is that warfare has just changed. It is not trench warfare or bombing campaigns anymore. It is cyber attacks that Liam has told you about. So yes, we may not be able to point to on-the-ground operations in recent years. That's just because of the changing face of warfare. But the efforts of NATO in recent times to address those sort of cyber threats has actually adequately defended them against the modern forms of warfare. Yeah, go for it.
When was the last cyber attack NATO quelled?
We probably don't know about them. Like, they're underground terrorist attacks. Maybe yesterday, maybe today, maybe this morning. Who knows? But I think their cyber operations should probably not be underestimated. They also tell us things about Ukraine and how NATO hasn't come to the defense of Ukraine. Firstly, Rob's already told you that there was no obligation for them to do so, so the mere fact of them not intervening in Ukraine is not evidence that NATO is obsolete. But I also question the efficacy of this type of approach, given that the whole war started in Ukraine because of the threat of NATO. I think an intervention by NATO in Ukraine would have caused severely more aggression from the Russian state and probably been very counteractive in terms of actually quelling the war, and would have led to significantly more deaths if there was actually NATO boots on the ground in a country that borders Russia. I don't think that would have been an efficacious strategy. I think most military strategists the whole world over know this, and that's probably why NATO didn't send people on the ground in Ukraine. But they also tell us what have we got from helping Ukraine? We haven't really gotten anything in return. I would just say tell that to the people in Kiev, tell that to the people in Crimea, tell that to an emerging democratic state that was a potential ally that now may fall to one of America and the Western world's biggest adversaries. I think we got a lot out of our contributions to NATO and saved countless lives, which I don't think you can really put a price on. They also said the same about Afghanistan. Was Afghanistan really worth it in the long run? Firstly, I don't think the burden of proving that NATO is not obsolete should be global peace. We shouldn't have to expect NATO to ensure that we all sit around and sing Kumbaya and hold hands, otherwise NATO has failed. Yes, not every operation is going to go exactly according to plan. That does not mean that the organization as a whole is obsolete, but I also think our efforts, NATO's efforts in Afghanistan, were very worthwhile. I think you should say that to the generations of girls who got to go to school, who otherwise wouldn't have if you didn't temporarily have a halt in the rule of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So yes, the pullout from Afghanistan was not ideal. It is far from ideal now that the Taliban are back in power, but I don't think you should underestimate those decades and the massive contributions that were made in Afghanistan regardless. So I think overall, we don't think NATO is perfect, but we don't think that means it is not obsolete. We think it is more than just a commitment to spend a certain amount of money. It is a commitment to defend democracy and a commitment to come to each other's aid when we need it. We think the deterrent effect has never been clearer, as no NATO country has ever been invaded. So because of all of these reasons, we don't think that NATO is obsolete.